Muting away.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rachel Daly, and I'm the president of the Federalist Society chapter at UVA Law. Before we get started, a few notes on logistics. At the end of this evening's program, we will open things up for Q&A. There are two ways you'll be able to ask a question. You can type your question into the chat box, or you can use the raise hand function and wait for the moderator to call on you. Before I turn it over, I'd like to introduce Professor Barbara Armacost, who will serve as the moderator for this evening's program. Professor Armacost teaches courses on civil rights litigation, criminal investigation, torts, and the First Amendment. Professor Armacost is a double who, and after she graduated from UVA Law, she clerked for Judge Wilkinson on the Fourth Circuit. She went on to serve as an attorney advisor in the Office of Legal Counsel at the U.S. Department of Justice before she returned to UVA Law to join the faculty. So thank you, Professor Armacost, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much to the Federalist Society at UVA Law School for putting this panel together, and welcome to all of you who are tuning in today. Let me begin with a couple of words of introduction. So our historical moment is seeing a dramatic groundswell of bipartisan support for criminal justice reform, including and especially police reform. Reformers have begun to agree on a number of issues that need to be addressed. One reform proposal that has been widely discussed is the abolishment of qualified immunity in civil lawsuits against police. Last week's Federalist Society panel addressed that issue. This week's panel is focusing on a broader, less well-defined, but very destructive feature of our criminal justice system, the problem of overcriminalization. Overcriminalization has a range of definitions, which our panelists will make very three-dimensional for you. But to give you a kind of rough and ready definition, overcriminalization occurs when the legislature and sometimes the courts define more conduct as criminal than prosecutors and police are able or willing to enforce. This gives executive officials too much discretion in determining who gets investigated, who gets prosecuted, and what sanctions are applied. This unbridled discretion has resulted in a range of injustices, which our panelists will address. So first, let me introduce our panelists. Would each of you raise your hand when you're being introduced so our audience will see who you are? First, let me introduce Professor Stephen Smith, who is a professor of law at the University of Notre Dame Law School, where he has taught since 2009. Professor Smith's area of expertise include criminal procedure, capital punishment and sentencing, constitutional law, and federal criminal law. He's written a number of articles and essays on the specific topic of overcriminalization. Before beginning his academic career, Smith was a litigation associate at the law firm of Sidley and Austin in Washington, D.C. We like to claim Professor Smith as our own, as he graduated from UVA and taught here from 2000 to 2009 before relocating to Notre Dame Law School. Professor Forde-Mazrui is the Mortimer M. Kaplan Professor of Law and the Earl K. Shaw Professor of Employment Law at the University of Virginia School of Law. Professor Forde-Mazrui is an expert on equal protection, particularly as applied to race and sexual orientation. He has co-authored a casebook on racial justice and the law, and written broadly on racial justice in a range of contexts, including adoption, affirmative action, and racial profiling in law enforcement. In 2003, Professor Forde-Mazrui was named the inaugural director of the Center for the Study of Race and Law at UVA, a center he continues to direct with distinction. Vikrant Reddy is a senior research fellow at the Charles Koch Institute, where he focuses his research and scholarship on criminal justice reform and overcriminalization. He's written on these topics in a variety of media outlets. Mr. Reddy previously served as a senior policy analyst at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and he is an appointee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Texas State Advisory Committee. Mr. Reddy also serves on the executive committee of the Criminal Law Practice Group of the Federalist Society. He earned his law degree at the Southern Methodist University School of Law, and he's admitted to the Texas Bar. Our fourth panelist is Jason Johnson, who is president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. Mr. Johnson has served over 20 years as a law enforcement officer, including serving as chair of the Baltimore Police Department's Performance Review Board. During his tenure on that board, Mr. Johnson oversaw improvements in recruiting, training, and technology at the department. Mr. Johnson is a graduate of the University of Maryland School of Law and the FBI Academy. He's been a vigorous and thoughtful advocate for finding ways to mend the divide between the police and the communities they serve. Each of our panelists will have the opportunity to speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. You can send in your questions anytime, and I will collect them, or I'll call on you if you use the raise hand function. So we'll begin our discussion with Professor Smith. So Professor Smith, would you set the stage for us by talking in more detail about what is meant by the term overcriminalization? What is it? How did it become such a problem in our criminal justice system? And how is it related to the protests that are going on all over our nation at this time? You're muted, Stephen.
How many professors does it take to use Zoom correctly? Should get the hang of this by now. Oops, I lost everyone. But it's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to interact with UVA Federalists. This is the chapter where I got my start back in 1989 as a 1L, and I really miss the vigorous debate and the commitment to principled exchanges of ideas with the UVA Federalists. So it's a pleasure to be back here. The only way it could be better, and also Professor Armacost and Professor Forde-Mazrui, my friends, hopefully not former friends and former colleagues there at UVA. The only way it can be better, it seems to me, if we were doing this live in Charlottesville over wine and cheese, but we'll settle for this. As Professor Armacost charged, I'm going to talk about overcriminalization and criminal justice reform more generally. First, I'm going to say a little bit about what overcriminalization means and talk about some of the various problems that it creates for the legal side system and society as a whole. Then I'll talk a little bit about recent bipartisan efforts at achieving criminal justice reform. And those efforts, I'll hope to show, are premised to a various degree on the notion that mass incarceration, using prisons and jails as the principal means of reducing crime, is a flawed strategy. And I'll close with some remarks, as indicated, on the current protest movements we're seeing. So first, what do we exactly mean by the term overcriminalization? The term itself suggests a quantitative objection, namely that we simply have too many criminal laws on the books today. The basic idea is that over time, criminal law has steadily grown to include conduct that either was or should be subject to only informal social sanctions or regulation through administrative or non-criminal means of enforcement. And on the criminal side, when we're dealing with activity that is properly regulated through the criminal law, we have an enormous problem of redundancy. We don't just have carefully defined statutes addressing particular criminal problems or criminal misbehavior, but we tend to have dozens and dozens. All right. Certainly no one can deny the remarkable growth we've seen since 1970, since the 60s really, in contemporary criminal codes. This has happened both at the state level and the federal level. In fact, at the federal level, there are so many federal criminal laws in force today that no one seems to have any more than a rough idea about how many criminal laws there are. The Federalist Society back in 2004 commissioned a study. They asked Professor John Baker of LSU to actually survey federal criminal law and to try to count the number of federal statutes that are that are contained in the U.S. Code. It's a tough job, much harder than it sounds. At the end of the day, he came up with about 4,500 different provisions in the United States codes that carry criminal penalties. But even that count, he said, was under-inclusive and remarkably under-inclusive. After all, some federal criminal laws don't define prohibited conduct on their own, but simply make it a crime to violate rules promulgated by federal administrative agencies. All right, and if you take into account those criminally enforceable administrative rules and regulations, the total number of actual criminal prohibitions in the federal system may be in the tens of thousands. So it's quite a remarkable amount of criminal law that's on the books. Now, how did we get here? How did we get to such an expansive use of the criminal sanction? And basically, it seems like there are many explanations, but it seems like we've succumbed to the view as a society that anything that's bad, whatever that might mean, should be, or at least can be, punishable by arrest, fines, and imprisonment. And the political system, not surprisingly, has responded with an ever-expanding roster of crimes, a roster that tends to grow even when crime rates are declining or low, as they were for decades beginning in early to mid-1990s. And the result of this enormous proliferation in criminal law, again at both the state and federal level, is a massive delegation of power to police and prosecutors. In this kind of system, they, not legislatures, make the law, and they do that through their decisions or enforcement decisions. And that leaves citizens in an unenviable position of dealing with this mountain of poorly defined criminal law and trying to figure out what their legal obligations are. Sometimes they can't do that until it's too late. So that's what I call the quantitative understanding of overcriminalization. I think it's worth mentioning briefly, in the interest of time, that there's also a qualitative component as well. On this view, it's not simply that there's too much federal criminal law or criminal law more generally on the books, it's that the criminal law that's there, even if we have the right amount, whatever that might be, the criminal codes that exist are simply too poorly defined to do an adequate job of confining criminal liability to appropriate bounds and fixing proportional punishments for blameworthy acts. And the problem here is that when you have overcriminalization, when overcriminalization is the order of the day, as it is at both the state and federal legislative levels, legislators pass new criminal laws like dead people used to vote in Chicago and maybe still vote in Chicago early and often. And so we had a 2010 Heritage Foundation report. It studied this and found that beginning in the 1990s and continuing into the 2010s, Congress passed on average 56 new federal crimes each and every year. Whether crime rates are increasing or decreasing as they were for most of that time, an average of 56 new crimes were added to the federal books each and every year. That's more than 500 crimes in a decade. And be mindful that a good part of that time, crime rates were declining dramatically across the country. And of course, that count, 56 new crimes, doesn't include situations where Congress amends existing criminal statutes to broaden the reach of those statutes or amends existing criminal statutes to raise the punishments. All right, so we just have a remarkable amount of criminal legislation going on. And when that happens, it perhaps comes as no surprise that legislatures often don't do an adequate job defining the critical actus reus and mens rea elements that define criminal liability. Ambiguity, as I mentioned, makes it hard for citizens and businesses to determine their legal obligations to comply with the law. It also allows the possibility that prosecutors may be able to convict for conduct that the legislature may not have intended to prohibit. These are problems in any system of laws. They're especially serious in the federal system, all right, because unlike many states, the federal government does not periodically review and revise the criminal code. The last successful code revision process in the federal system, believe it or not, took place in 1948. All right, that was before modern crime definition in the form of the model penal code even existed. So the federal criminal code looks very much like my basement. Stuff is added to it. It's not sorted. It's not easily accessible. There's just a lot of junk there that people can trot out, prosecutors can trot out anytime they see fit. I am the homeowner. I have no idea what's in my basement. I just know there's a lot of stuff down there. All right. And that's kind of how a criminal code works in a regime of overcriminalization. All right. And again, the result of this proliferation of federal criminal law, of the messiness, the arbitrariness, the ambiguity with which criminal codes tend to be written, is more power for police, for law enforcement agents, and for prosecutors to determine what is and isn't a crime, what and who should and shouldn't go to prison, and for how long. Right. So that is both the qualitative and quantitative aspect of overcriminalization. Let me say there's also an overpunishment issue. I don't want to spend any time talking about that. We can talk about that if you like, during the Q&A. And so there's been, over the last generation or so, remarkable agreement from left, right, and in between that overcriminalization is a problem for the legal system. There's also been an agreement, again, on a bipartisan agreement, not universal, but and all over the points in the political spectrum are coming together to say that we need criminal justice reform, that mass incarceration is a costly and counterproductive strategy, that there have to be better ways of responding to crime than simply warehousing large bodies of people in state and federal prisons and jails. And of course, as we know, the United States is the world's leader, the world's leading jailer. We have 5% of the world's population, more than a quarter of the prisoners in the world. Our closest allies, Western Europe, are nowhere near us. I think our closest country that comes closest to us are China, Russia, regimes that we don't normally align ourselves with. It is truly remarkable how extensive our criminal justice system and our prison population is. All right, and so there's a growing sense that this is too much, and of course there's a growing sense that the racial disparities that happen as a result of mass incarceration are deplorable. The vast majority of people in state and federal correctional facilities are Black and brown people. They're substantially overrepresented, and arrestees and convicts, they get longer sentences. They're substantially overrepresented in cases of lethal use of force by police officers. And the time has come to change this approach. Unfortunately, the federal government has sort of lagged behind on this particular issue. The states are doing more. They haven't done enough on that. We can go into that later. Maybe some other panelists will go into that as well. Let me just say the use of the protests we're seeing across the country now, just to wrap up, on the surface, they seem to be simply about the problem of police brutality and police mistreatment of minority suspects. It's certainly about that. But I think if we look a little deeper, we see that overcriminalization is a real problem here. George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police because he was suspected of the serious crime of having passed, knowingly or not, a potentially counterfeit $20 bill. Eric Garner was choked to death on Staten Island for the serious crime of selling loose cigarettes. Alton Sterling was gunned down in Baton Rouge by police. He was selling bootleg CDs. Freddie Brown in Ferguson, all right, was walking in the street, and that's why he was confronted by the police officer who eventually killed him. He was also suspected by the police department. I'm not sure if the police officer in question knew that, but anyway, he was suspected of having stolen some cigarillos from a local convenience stores. All right, Walter Scott in North Charleston was shot in the back 5 times, fleeing from the police. He was stopped for having a taillight out. He had an arrest warrant out, not for any criminal action, but simply for being behind in child support payments. All right, and these are all cases where Black men were needlessly killed by the police for minor offenses. All right, so whenever we talk about criminalization, it's not enough simply to say, is the conduct bad? If so, let's attach a criminal penalty to us. Whenever we attach a criminal penalty, we are enabling armed agents of the state with the power to kill to go out there and initiate coercive interactions with people. We've seen the deadly wake that happens when that. So we need to take over criminalization very strongly. Yes, we need to reform policing. There are deep problems in our criminal justice system, but overcriminalization, I think, is one of those problems. And I hope we will focus on that as a society in dealing with the very real complaints about Black lives not appearing to matter in the view of the law. And I think I should stop there to allow our co-panelists to take over.
Thank you so much, Professor Smith. This gives us a really good starting point. You've just really painted overcriminalization in such a stark and startling way. You've helped us to see how it came about and how it relates to our current moment. So thank you so much for that. We turn now to Professor Forde-Mazrui. Professor Forde-Mazrui, you've written extensively on issues of race and the law. Can you help us drill down on the relationship between overcriminalization and racial discrimination?
Absolutely, thank you. And I'm thrilled to be on this panel and to see my good friend and former colleague, Steve Smith. I just regret following in his outstanding footsteps, given his eloquence, insights, and humor, but I'll do my best. So my remarks I'm titling Overcriminalization, Racial Injustice, and the Federalist Society. And I am going to focus on race discrimination and racial justice concerns. First, just want to say a few remarks about the harms of overcriminalization, and Professor Smith described them well. I'm thinking more in terms of local level policing on the street and in traffic enforcement. So overcriminalization in those contexts has two harms, liberty and equality. Briefly on liberty, it's fairly self-evident, but to the extent this means people are being investigated by the police for crimes the legislature has defined as such, which shouldn't be crimes, then people are unnecessarily subject to investigation, search, potentially tense situations with police that can spiral into violent confrontations, the court costs and collateral consequences of having a conviction, and of course, time in jail can also occur. So unnecessary restraints on liberty. The second is equality, and here I'm thinking more in terms of race discrimination. And overcriminalization, as Professor Smith indicates, does create a problem of racial disparity and race discrimination. And to elaborate more on why that is so, it's because the legislature has failed to give police adequate guidance. We saw this historically with vague laws, and there still are laws that are, still too ambiguous. But before, there were extremely vague laws, vagrancy, loitering, walking without lawful business. And they really could apply to virtually anybody. And so police were left to kind of their own intuitions as to how to enforce them. And it meant that they would rely on their own sense of whether somebody seemed suspicious or out of place. And the Supreme Court eventually struck those down in the 1970s and a few cases since, on the ground that they encouraged too much race discrimination. And this assumes police are acting in good faith, by the way, because it assumes that if the laws were more specific and said, these are who you should go after, these are who you should not, by defining the elements clearly, the police would honor that. But if it defines it in a fuzzy, vague way, then police have to decide for themselves, well, who looks suspicious, who looks like they're engaged in annoying behavior, who looks like they're loitering without apparent business. And so they're left to rely on their hunches, and police, as much as everybody in society, is going to be subject to police biases that range in degree of severity. And defining the laws more specifically creates similar problems to the extent overcriminalization still casts a wide net by criminalizing all sorts of fairly harmless behavior on the street, whether it's jaywalking, littering, public intoxication, curfews. Traffic regulations are pretty much impossible for any driver to comply with on a consistent basis. So even though they're specific, they still make a broad scope of who police are authorized to investigate. But it does it for too many people, so police don't have the resources to go after everybody. They have to pick and choose. Because it's fairly harmless behavior, they're also not going to be held account if they don't enforce it, because people aren't going to complain that much. And so they're again left to draw on their own devices and hunches. That often includes racial biases, class biases, pretextual stops that the Supreme Court has upheld, even if they lack reasonable suspicion, so long as there's a probable cause of some illegal conduct. So it encourages race discrimination, and there are a lot of various potential ways to try and reduce that. I want to focus on just two judicial doctrines that I think reinforce racial injustice from overcriminalization, and I'm afraid these are doctrines that I not only blame for racial injustice, but I also would observe that the Federalist Society promotes these principles. I say that not to be unnecessarily critical. I say that because I believe the Federalist Society, and I say this with admiration, is open to self-evaluation. I mentioned to the host that I would say some critical words, and they welcome that. I think this event itself shows a desire to learn, as we all should during this situation. So I think it's worth pointing out that there are principles that I think do contribute to racial injustice. So I'll just focus on two. The first is colorblind equal protection, by which I mean the judicial doctrine that treats race-conscious government action as presumptively unconstitutional, even when it's designed to benefit racial minorities or otherwise reduce racial inequality. We see that most clearly in the Supreme Court doctrines on affirmative action, but it applies to any government action that's motivated by race consciousness. That contributes to racial injustice because it prevents addressing the problem. Whenever I try to discuss, whether in my class or with other scholars, what kinds of policies would help to reduce racial inequality and racial injustice in the criminal justice system, many of the proposals that seem the most obvious ways to address it run into problems of, oh, but that might violate equal protection. Just two examples, if you recall, in Ferguson, where Michael Brown was killed, it was revealed that although the population is predominantly Black, the police force was overwhelmingly white. But to engage in race-conscious hiring to try and diverse the police force would run against colorblind equal protection and could be challenged. Even assigning cops based on race to police certain communities could be challenged because of violating colorblind equal protection. It also prohibits addressing some of the underlying causes of what leads to police-suspect interactions. Poor education and economic opportunities in low-income Black communities is what leads Black people to often be in public under circumstances that result in police confrontations. But colorblind equal protection limits the extent to which we can address those economic and educational disadvantages. And then the second principle that courts impose and also is supported by the Federalist Society is separation of powers. In this context, I mean the tendency of courts to impose virtually impossible standards for proving race discrimination on separation of powers grounds. So cases like Washington versus Davis, which requires proof of intent, that was based in part on separation of powers. The case Wren versus United States that allows pretextual stops, US versus Armstrong, that makes it impossible to prove prosecutorial discrimination, McCluskey versus Kemp, that makes it impossible to prove jury discrimination, were all based in substantial part on separation of powers concerns that this is not the court's role to prevent race discrimination in these contexts. They always said that ultimately that would violate the Constitution, but separation of powers led the courts in all of these cases to adopt proof standards that are virtually impossible to prove, and accordingly, there's going to not be accountability, and without accountability, the race discrimination will not be deterred. So those are the two principles. Those would need to be reformed as one piece of addressing the problem. Legislative reforms and crime definition would obviously be another. So I want to conclude with some questions for the Federalist Society and for all of us to reflect upon. First, assuming the principles of colorblind equal protection and separation of powers are in fact important and legitimate principles that motivate Federalist Society position here, we should ask, is it worth the harm? Abstract principles should be evaluated, at least in part, on their human consequences. And if these principles are leading to racial injustice with, unfortunately, too often fatal consequences, then we need to ask whether the principles need to be modified or softened in some respect. The second question I would ask is, or at least encourage the Federalist Society to be aware, is people understandably question whether these positions are in fact even principled. And what I mean by that is, even if you take Federalist Society principles, some of these positions don't actually seem to follow from them. So Originalism is the principal mode of interpreting the Constitution that the Federalist Society and its members advocate. But there is no persuasive originalist case for colorblindness under the Constitution. I could elaborate for hours, but I'll succinctly say at this point, if there were such a case, Justice Scalia and Thomas would have made it in one of the affirmative action cases. For decades, they've been writing about the Constitution being colorblind, and they've never made an originalist argument for it. So why is the Federalist Society not just saying, sorry, affirmative action is bad policy, you could say, if you believe that, but it's not covered by the Constitution, so we need to change it through the Constitution if we want to abolish it, just like originalists say about discrimination against women and LGBT people. Many say that's wrong, but it's not covered by the Constitution. So where does the position come from? And then with respect to the impossible proof standards, here the puzzle is, it follows from the first point, colorblind equal protection. The Federalist Society emphasizes that colorblindness is a constitutional imperative. Justice Clarence Thomas says there are no exceptions to it. It's not different from old style segregation. Colorblindness is, almost a super constitutional harm. Guarantee. Well, if that's true, that is, if race consciousness by the government is one of the most constitutionally worst things that could happen, then it should follow that we err in favor of rooting it out and preventing it, even where there is uncertainty. So if you think about our burdens of proof, we believe as a society that it's worse to convict an innocent person, as the saying goes, than to let 10 guilty people go free, even though that's inaccurate to let 10 guilty people go free. But we still err, we stack the deck through our burdens of proof and procedures in favor of letting the guilty go free, resolving the uncertainty in favor of the accused. So if race consciousness is so constitutionally harmful, then our procedures for proving it should not be so insurmountable. They should actually be designed to ferret it out, even at the expense of sometimes being wrong. But instead, the courts, especially Federalist Society judges, apply doctrines that basically say, unless the defendant can rule out every conceivable explanation for why they were investigated by police or prosecuted by prosecutors or convicted by juries, we will presume that it was not based on race. So that doesn't seem to follow from the emphasis on the importance of colorblindness. And this avoiding seeing race, even when it might be there, is something that I've even just noticed in the description of this panel. Again, I appreciate it being created and appreciate being included, but I found it striking that the title of the panel and the description of the panel do not mention race. They mention criminal justice reform, overcriminalization. They even mention George Floyd. I can't imagine ever discussing any of those three topics, let alone combined, and race not being one of the most important aspects of the discussion, yet it doesn't describe it, use the term. And so the Federalist Society should be aware that people are understandably skeptical that their positions that contribute to, in a sense, locking in the racial status quo may reflect in people's minds an indifference on the part of the Federalist Society to racism and racial injustice, or put another way, people may understandably wonder, does the Federalist Society believe that Black lives matter? So I thank you for indulging me on that. Thank you.
Thank you for Professor Forde-Mazrui for those challenges, both on the issue of race discrimination and also on the issues of legal doctrines that prevent solutions. So to understand even, to continue to unfold the relationship between overcriminalization and race discrimination, Mr. Reddy, we've heard a suggestion from Mr. Professor Forde-Mazrui and also Professor Smith, that racism is baked into our criminal justice system. It's not just a relational thing, but it's structural in some sense. And there's this term that's widely used, institutional racism or structural racism. So what I'd like you to do is address those issues. What exactly is structural racism, and how does it relate to overcriminalization? Can you get us into those topics?
I would love to, and hopefully by the end of talking a bit about that, I will get my Federalist Society friends to actually become a bit more comfortable with those terms, because I think, perhaps somewhat unusual for a Federalist Society member, and I have been one for 16 years, that they are useful terms, that they are terms that help shed a little bit more light on what is happening in American criminal justice. Let me start by acknowledging that I think those terms, institutional racism, structural racism, systemic racism, whatever you want to say, I think they tend to be used very imprecisely and somewhat carelessly by a lot of my progressive friends. And I understand that my conservative friends, therefore, will recoil at the way that the terms are being used. Sometimes the terms simply are used to mean that everyone in the American criminal justice system is racist, or perhaps to put it more charitably, most of the people in the American criminal justice system are racist. Conservatives recoil at that for two reasons. Number one, they simply think it's false. They think it's not fair to demonize so many people who are working hard in American criminal justice, whether they are police officers or judges or prosecutors or probation officers. You can't demonize all these people by calling them racist. So they object on that level. But secondly, I think they object because they don't necessarily see where a conversation like that leads us. Well, if everybody's racist, what are we going to do about it? Congress can't very well pass a don't be racist law and solve that problem overnight. So they don't really find that particular line of condemnation to be productive. But I think conservatives ought to step back and realize that just because a term is used imprecisely or carelessly doesn't mean that there aren't valid ways to use the term. That the term doesn't have some real, doesn't have a correct usage and also have something to teach us. I think it's more useful to think of institutional racism in a very precise and careful way as these kinds of institutions and structures that we create inadvertently, in fact, often in well-meaning ways, that nevertheless perpetuate racial harms in a society. I'll give you one really simple example. Think about school zone laws. These are laws that most people are familiar with, which will enhance the penalty for selling drugs if you are within 1,000 yards of a school. That distance will differ depending on what jurisdiction you're in, but just about every jurisdiction in America has got some kind of school zone law that says if you're selling drugs within X distance of a school, the penalty gets enhanced considerably. Those laws were all passed by very well-meaning people, and often with always with the very laudable goal of trying to keep drugs out of the hands of children. Everybody would agree with that goal. And in fact, with these particular laws, if you look at the kinds of people who often were behind them, it was very frequently Black legislators who cared deeply about the crack epidemic and the fact that it was devastating their communities. There's a great book that I'd commend to the Federalist Society members on the call by Jim Foreman, the professor at Yale Law School, called Locking Up Our Own. It's all about that phenomenon. But anyhow, I mention this because it's worth thinking about how these laws might disproportionately come down on Black Americans, even though that's not what anybody intended. Assume that you grew up the way I grew up. I'm Indian American, I'm middle class. I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, in a pretty leafy suburb. If you go to my old high school, all around it, you see soccer fields, football fields, baseball diamond, just lots of open space. Those are not places where people sell drugs. You don't sell drugs on the 40-yard line in the middle of a suburban school's football field. Assume, however, that you go to an urban high school. Across the street from an urban high school, easily within 1,000 yards of the high school, You just have apartment complexes. You have barbershops. You have laundromats. You have the places where people just do everything. That's where they live their lives, because urban spaces are different than suburban and rural spaces. Black Americans constitute 13% of this country's population, but they constitute 27% of the country's urban population. So if you pass a penalty enhancement, and Professor Smith was talking a bit about this when he said that there's an overpunishment problem that's a component of the overcriminalization problem. If you pass this kind of a penalty enhancement, it's obviously going to fall on Black Americans much more harshly than it does on non-Black Americans. Not, again, because anybody intended that to happen. In fact, I think if you would have told people who are behind these laws 20 or 30 years ago that this will be the result down the line, they would have blanched and said, oh goodness, let's not do that. Or they may have included, and Professor Smith kind of hinted at this too, an appropriate mens rea component that would have said, well, if you are really intending to sell drugs to children, then the penalty enhances. By the way, you can go back and change your laws and do something like that. South Carolina did that about 10 years ago. I think that was a welcome change. But to get back to my basic point, you can have laws like this, you can have institutions like this that perpetuate these racial harms unknowingly. And in that way, you can have a system that becomes institutionally racist. I think it's very useful to think about the term in that way, a way that does actually attribute good faith to most of the people who are involved in the legislative process, but nevertheless appreciates that you can have these kinds of harms, and we have to be more careful about them on the front end. That's just one small example. There really is, and this goes back to a bit of what Professor Smith was talking about, just this this instinct that we have in the United States to treat so many social harms with criminal penalties rather than in some other way. And Professor Smith mentioned the case of Eric Garner, which I think is particularly instructive in this case. The state of New York, for reasons that I still don't fully understand, criminalized selling individual cigarettes rather than selling them by the pack. And that led to a police officer having a conversation, an adversarial conversation with Eric Garner in Staten Island when they saw him selling these loose cigarettes. I think it was back in 2014 or 2015. That adversarial conversation turned violent, as some percentage of adversarial conversations with the police necessarily will, and resulted in the chokehold that killed Eric Garner. And we had a big national conversation about chokeholds and about whether or not they were a correct policing technique. And that was a valuable conversation, and that conversation should continue. But a conversation that wasn't sufficiently prompted, I think, was the question of why that action needed to be criminalized in the first place. Why did we need to make it against the law, against the criminal law, to sell loose cigarettes on the corner? Because that is the reason that the original adversarial conversation was prompted. We have hundreds, thousands of these kinds of unnecessary laws that provoke unnecessary conversations. There's another terrific law professor at Yale named Stephen Carter, who says that on the first day of his crim law classes, he tells his 1Ls that you shouldn't pass a criminal sanction unless you are willing to kill somebody over it. Because that's essentially what you've authorized. You've essentially authorized agents of the state to go and enforce those criminal laws. And some percentage of those enforcement actions are going to turn deadly. So you want to be very, very careful about what you choose to make criminal in a society. So this is the way that I think all of these things, overcriminalization, overpunishment, race, institutional racism, all of it kind of merges into a very serious dysfunction that we've had in America. Well, I was about to say for decades, but you could really make the case we've had it for centuries. But I think it's healthy that we're having a big conversation about it right now. I think it's healthy that the Federalist Society is taking the issue very seriously and saying, well, we want to have a big conversation about this at the University of Virginia. Things like that give me optimism that we're perhaps on the right track as a society, but I think I'll leave it at that. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Johnson, then having a larger dialogue amongst all of us. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. So thank you so much for making that connection, the on-the-ground connection between policing and overcriminalization, and pointing out that so many of those police shootings, and Professor Smith also talked about this, that many police incidents start with the overcriminalization problem, that is the criminalization of conduct that probably shouldn't have been criminalized in the first place. So, Mr. Johnson, as a policing expert, you are on the hot seat, and you're also on the front lines of police reform. And one of the most dramatic proposals that's been put forward is this whole defunding the police movement. And so what I'd like you to do, if you would, is first of all, describe to us what this defund the police movement is about. And then if you would tell us, do you think the defund the police movement actually has any insights for us, even if you don't embrace the whole idea? Does the defund the police movement have any insights toward the necessary kinds of police reform or police reform you think would be useful?
Great. Well, thank you for Professor Armacost for the question. I appreciate the opportunity, of course, to participate in this panel over such an important topic, and one that's so heavily linked with policing, which is sort of my niche and my part of this conversation. So the defunding police conversation means different things to different people, and I've come to have that conversation with a number of people who have different ideas about what it means to defund police, or some will even go so far as to say dismantle police or dismantle police organizations, and I'll have a little bit more on that later. But I was surprised to learn, because when I first heard the defund police movement, which I must admit, I heard for, I think, really the first time in earnest after the killing of George Floyd. Perhaps it's a conversation that's been going on for a while, but it was doing it without my knowledge. Certainly, if I'd heard about it, I may not have taken it that seriously, but now I think everyone takes the conversation seriously. I think really it means something different than what it sounds like it means. To me, it sounds like municipal governments should literally cut their law enforcement organizations' budgets either entirely or in part or in significant part. And really, I think what I've come to understand most people mean by the term is simply to narrow the focus of law enforcement, narrow what police officers and police organizations do. And I don't agree that police budgets should be cut necessarily, or if they are, I think we need to take a close look at what services we're willing to part with. But I do believe that the performance of police organizations should be narrowed. And overcriminalization is just part of this. Another part of it really is, who do we want to respond to people in crisis? Who do we want the first responders to be for people in mental health crisis, for homeless individuals in crisis, for any number of things that are decidedly not criminal, that police officers are really the government agency of last resort. Police departments, whether the audience knows it or not, many government agencies really narrow their own scope of what they're willing to get involved in. They don't work nights, they don't work weekends, they don't have expertise in this area or that area, but police departments tend to take on whatever is left over. And I think that's how, over time, the burden of responding to mental health crisis is probably the big one, because that's the one that so often results in a use of force that perhaps wouldn't be necessary if the initial response was by a social worker or other mental health professional that was better equipped to deal with it, frankly. If that's what we mean by defunding the police, not only am I on board, but I think the vast majority of the law enforcement community is on board as well, because the law enforcement community itself recognizes that it's not the best equipped professional to respond to many of these cases. Now, that doesn't mean that the police will no longer have to respond or be needed to respond to every mental health crisis that the government responds to, or every person who is addicted to drugs that the government has to respond to. But many instances they won't be required, and when they are, they can take a back seat and just simply provide for security and let the other professionals take the lead. In terms of how defunding and overcriminalization sort of intersect, I think that, and I'm pleased that each of the other panelists brought up, some of these other very high-profile police cases the death of George Floyd, obviously, the police initially got involved because he allegedly tried to pass a $20 counterfeit bill, whether that was the case or not. Don't know much about what led from the initial response to what we have all now seen on video, which is disturbing for every person that's watched it, more than disturbing. Eric Garner, of course, selling loose cigarettes, and that the reason that loose cigarettes are selling of loose cigarettes is unlawful is because of collecting the tax on cigarettes. And in New York State, I think the tax on a pack of cigarettes is like $20 or something. So the state doesn't want people to sell loose cigarettes because they miss out on the tax revenue. Freddie Gray in Baltimore, a case nobody else has mentioned. Freddie Gray was supposedly a very small-time drug dealer. He'd had a lot of contacts with law enforcement. Of course, he was poor, lived in public housing, many contacts, some prior arrests for minor offenses. And the day that the police encountered him in Baltimore in 2015, I think they really, even the police said that he was in an area known for drug dealing. When they saw the police, when he saw the police officers, he ran. Now, there is a Supreme Court case that authorizes law enforcement under some circumstances, maybe under those circumstances, to pursue and stop a person in a high crime area, again, very subjective, who runs headlong flight from the police. And that's the reason they encountered him. Now, when they stopped him, the reason he was arrested is that he had a small folding knife in his pocket. And although I think most people, although there's some dispute, there's been a lot of conversation about it, most people, or many people that I listen to anyway, say that technically that knife was unlawful. But I mean, if we take a step back and we look at, we're sending police officers, and again, those police officers weren't there they didn't just pick that day to be in that particular location. Ironically, they had received a request from the Baltimore State's Attorney's Office to patrol that area for reports of drug dealing, and that's what brought them there. That's what led to their encounter with Mr. Gray. Mr. Gray's arrest occurred because he had a small folding knife. And that's just one of many examples of criminal laws that are on the books. This is a topic that we're talking about tonight that really ought not to be. And even though, you can count on a relatively small number still of people who died as a result of police encounters that happened because of laws that I think we can all probably agree things that should not be criminalized. There are still many more who have encounters with the police and they don't have a use of force, or they don't die, but they do get arrested, and they do have to go to a detention center, and many times will spend a considerable amount of time detained, certainly well in excess of what the maximum penalty would be for the underlying offense. So I think that it's important for the conversation purposes to get out there that police officers aren't proponents of overcriminalization. This is not their fault. This is not that police officers don't pass laws. They don't sign bills into law. They simply are charged with enforcing the laws that are on the books today. And if we, as a society, if we look at whether it's George Floyd is what causes us to look at this, or any number of other reasons, we really focus on this issue of overcriminalization, we'll realize that although the police tend to carry the burden of the results of overcriminalization, they sort of wear the uniform that represents the ill effects of overcriminalization of predominantly poor people, and speak to my own personal experience there in a second. Predominantly poor people are being, bearing the brunt of not only of a lot of criminal laws that shouldn't be crimes, but also penalties that exceed what they should be for traffic offenses and a lot of the lower level offenses that, for me or for probably anyone on this panel, if we had to pay $500 to get our car out of impound because it wasn't, there wasn't the right tag on it, we wouldn't be happy about it, but we could do it. Many people, as we all know in this country, that's not an option. Your car gets impounded by the police because you didn't, some technical violation or some citation that you received, you just don't have a car. And that means maybe you can't get to work, or maybe you can't take your kids to school, or any number of other things. So my personal experience as having been a police officer, ultimately as a police executive and involved in reform, but also now in my present role involved in advocating for police officers. But my personal experience, my first few years, I worked in a urban community. I was probably in excess of 90% Black. The police department was diverse, but not as diverse as the community. We were probably in that area, I'd say probably close to 50% white, 50% Black. But I'm getting completely into anecdotal information here, but I didn't see anything in my career that I identified as racist. I didn't hear any of my colleagues use racist terms or do anything that I thought was, mistreating members of our community where we worked. I didn't see any what I identified as selecting racial minorities for different treatment or anything. It was all, I just felt like we were doing the job the best we could, the way we were trained, and in a good faith effort to, uphold the law. That was our job after all. But in retrospect, all these years later, and maybe a little bit wiser, I start to recognize some of the systemic problems that we simply were too young or unsophisticated to recognize. We had no intent of discriminating against anyone or treating anyone poorly. But at the end of the day, some of those things that I mentioned, that really, really minor offenses that really probably shouldn't be crimes, possession of drug paraphernalia, a lot of traffic offenses that the fines are draconian, or they result in cars being impounded. It has a devastating effect on poor people. And in the community that I worked in, the poor people were also Black. Now there are other communities where the poor people are brown or the poor people are white, and I suspect that in those cases, in those situations, that these punitive criminal laws, punitive traffic laws, punitive fines affect poor people regardless of their race, regardless of their nationality. It's just that in America, in our big urban centers, and even in our small urban centers, the poorer people tend to be the Black and brown people, and so it does affect them, even though, for whatever my word is worth, that is not I can't speak for every police officer in America, but that is not, it would shock a lot of people how, again, my perspective, that overt racism or even maybe hidden racial bias probably isn't as common as people think. We all, I'm certain, have certain biases, but I just think it is more systemic under the definition Mr. Reddy articulated, that the system can be set up to very adversely impact people of color. And I think the huge volume of criminal offenses that shouldn't be crimes at all is a big reason for that. I'll just move on before I close to talk a little bit about what I consider an irony that has sprung out of the killing of George Floyd. The Minneapolis Police Department, which the officers were a part of that killed George Floyd, the immediate response, and of course there have been countless protests and riots and other exercises, whether they're peaceful or not, in protest to the death of George Floyd. The city council in Minneapolis was the first that I'm aware of, municipal legislature, to pass a bill beginning to act to dismantle, not defund, but dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department and replace it with a public safety system. That it hasn't explained what the public safety system is yet. Presumably it will have some law enforcement component to it, which I guess is another way of saying police department, because I don't think we are in a place where we simply don't need law enforcement. We do need law enforcement. We just need law enforcement to be done in a little different way. So they've taken action to do that. But again, it is the police department and police officers who are on the front lines kind of accepting the blame for what is wrong in the criminal justice system, or representing the negative aspects of the criminal justice system as the most visible part of the criminal justice system. But it's ironic that, you know, Minneapolis is or Minnesota, the state of Minnesota is actually one of the biggest offenders in as far as states in overcriminalization. They have a criminal code that has 327 chapters. The model penal code, I believe, only has about 114. And in addition to, as Professor Smith articulated in the federal system, in addition to the criminal code, there are criminal penalties throughout their entire statutory body. And in addition to that, there are criminal penalties for violating their administrative in certain parts of their administrative regulations. And so Minnesota has an overcriminalization problem. And just for example, and I looked this up myself in the Minnesota Criminal Code, and there are many examples of things like this. But vagrancy is a misdemeanor in the Minnesota Criminal Code. Vagrancy has a couple different definitions, but one definition of a vagrant that would be violating the law, the criminal law in Minnesota, is a person who derives support as a fortune teller. So if you're a fortune teller in Minnesota, you're a vagrant, and that means you're subject to being charged with a misdemeanor with whatever their default, probably up to a year in jail in many places for a misdemeanor. You know, making a false or defamatory statement to the media. So if you lie to the media, that's a misdemeanor in Minnesota. I'm glad it's not where I live. You can't wear it's a violation of the Minnesota Criminal Code to wear a mask or other disguise in a public place. So here we're all complying with COVID-19 safety regulations by wearing a mask, but in Minnesota, and there's no, I'm familiar with some state statutes that prohibit wearing a mask, but there's always this with the intent to, you know, avoid identification after committing a crime, or it's usually tied to something to prevent someone who is completely innocent of anything. They're trying to prevent the spread of COVID-19, or perhaps it's Halloween and they're wearing a mask. But in Minneapolis or in Minnesota, it doesn't matter. If you're wearing a mask or you attempt to disguise your face in a public place, it's a misdemeanor. So I say all that to say, and I recalling that I'm a law enforcement policing advocate, that although police are not blameless, and we're not police apologists, and certainly there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that front, for the Minneapolis City Council for their first step is to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department, rather than take a look at the problem in their state of overcriminalization. Just reinforces to me that I believe that cops are always the ones that get blamed for lots of other parts of the system. Again, cops not blameless here, but lots of other parts of the system that probably should be fixed because they're more baked in, they're more fundamental to the problem. So I think I will wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of those thoughts, and for responding to some of your panelists as well. So let's go back to the gallery view. And Kim, you're back. That's good. So there aren't a lot of questions. So those of you out there, if you've got a question, please put it in the chat room or raise your hand. But I do have one question to begin with, which is maybe a hard question to start with. But you know, we've talked about this big problem of overcriminalization, and it's a problem in it's a structural problem in the criminal justice system. And and there's this great sort of enthusiasm about police reform and about criminal justice reform. And I guess I want to ask, like, if you could think of one reform that's actually possible or plausible that we could work on that would begin to address this overcriminalization problem. Would it be federal? Would it be state? What would it be exactly? Like, what would you recommend if you could recommend something? What would it be? What should we do? What should we begin to do about this overcriminalization problem?
You want me to take a stab at that?
Sure.
Okay. Well, it's a good question, a hard question, but if I had my druthers, I would say, end the war on drugs. I mean, I think a lot of the problems we have with overcriminalization and criminal justice all stem from the war on drugs, such as a lot of the Fourth Amendment standards that you and Professor Forde-Mazrui talk about and you study. There's almost like a drug exception where the Supreme Court over time has watered down the requirements to search, to seize, to make it easier to enforce the war on drugs. I think that a lot of the severity and punishments that we've seen has come from this obsession with drugs. I mean, Michigan, for example, at one time made selling a certain quantity of drugs punishable by a life sentence in prison. We had the draconian and infamous 100-to-1 sentencing rule for crack cocaine, so that for federal sentencing purposes, a gram of crack cocaine was treated as 100 grams of powder. The necessary result of that, A, is to punish blacks more severely than whites, because whites tend to use and deal powder cocaine, blacks tend to use and deal crack cocaine, and it basically treated mules, lower level people who traffic in small amounts of crack cocaine, as equivalently for sentencing purposes in federal court to much more significant dealers in powder cocaine. So I think the war on drugs has sort of been the tail that wagged the dog. It certainly kicked off mass incarceration with the Rockefeller laws in New York, with federal sentencing guidelines that were binding until 2005, and with a lot of these statutory mandatory minimums. Those are pretty much all features of the war on drugs. And of course, asset forfeiture is a huge part of the war on drugs. This whole idea of policing for profit, that police have a baked-in interest in over-enforcing drug laws because they can seize the vehicles and the planes and the cash that's gotten from perpetrators of drug offenses. So that would be my silver bullet. And, when you look at the federal system, that in and of itself is a huge blow to mass incarceration, because until recent years, when immigration offenses have taken off, the majority of people in the federal system were there for drug offenses. And as Michelle Alexander tells us, the majority of federal offenders in prison, including the majority of drug dealers in federal prison, are all nonviolent, all right? They don't have to be there, all right? But it's because of the war on drugs that they're there.
So do you think, and I'm gonna add an addendum, and you can answer this question that I've posed any way you want, but the addendum is, so would addressing the war on drugs also address policing issues? So, because one of the things that Mr. Johnson talked about is, and the rest of you have too, is that there are all these there's so many statutes, and every time, and Stephen, you said this, every time you pass a statute, you've basically loosed the police on people who violate that statute. So would addressing the war on drugs also address the overcriminalization problem in policing?
I think it would, because so many of these stops, like Professor Forde-Mazrui talked about pretextual police stops, where they stop you because of some traffic violation, but they're really not interested in the traffic violation. It's minor. What they're really stopping you for, what there is in a lot of cases, it's contraband. They're looking for drugs, maybe they're looking for firearms. Drugs and contraband are especially pertinent to the problem of policing in inner city minority neighborhoods. And I certainly agree with Mr. Johnson. I was glad he said that. It's not just police advocates who think defund the police is a silly concept. I mean, I think the underlying idea makes sense, but they should talk about reforming or reimagining police. Defunding the police is certainly not in the interest of minorities. In fact, I think if you look at inner city minorities, they suffer from under-policing and bad policing. They need more policing to secure life, liberty, and property, and they don't get it. The problem is the Karens of the world, suburbanites, get protective policing. Police protect them, and they sort of act as almost as occupying forces in inner city neighborhoods. They roll up looking for drugs. They stop people for pretexts. They search, they do very aggressive things that alienate the people they're supposed to be protecting. And I think the war on drugs really has had a detrimental impact on how policing is done in this country. It wouldn't solve all the problems related to policing, but it would certainly go a long way. And I think Camden is a case, Camden, New Jersey is a case where I think my understanding is that they sort of stripped down, they sort of abolished their police department and rebuilt it from the ground up. The problem is with police departments is currently constructed, and Mr. Johnson can speak more to this if he likes, police unions are a huge obstacle to reform. I know you've written in the past about police culture. I think you've written about that, right? The culture of police agencies becomes a huge barrier for reform. And you have police chiefs, police executives, many times who want to make changes, but they're prevented by Policeman Bill of Rights, by union contracts, by the sort of institutional culture they inherited from making changes. And if you can't change the institution from within, and we know because of qualified immunity and other things, you can't change it from without, court actions are not going to do the trick. President Obama was using civil suits to try to reform police departments. Of course, President Trump has gotten us out of that business. So now it's almost like you have to go back to square one with the police department. So I understand the impetus for trying to start from scratch in Minneapolis. They've also had continuing problems for years, all right? And the police department has refused to reform. And so now they're faced with taking dire steps, which couldn't have been necessary, but I'm glad at least they're looking into these issues.
Could I just respond to that?
Yes.
Briefly. Camden County is recognized as sort of a very good example of reforming a department by replacing it. It was sort of a repeal and replace. There was a Camden City Police Department. It was dysfunctional, needed to be reformed, couldn't be reformed. So they built the Camden County Police Department from scratch. And as that department grew in strength and capabilities, they eliminated the Camden City. I shouldn't say many, some of the officers were able to transition from the old agency to the new agency, but not every officer. And they freed themselves from some collective bargaining agreements that were not going to help them to reform. And I do agree that in some cases, those are impediments to reform, not in every case. In the Northeast and the Midwest, the union parts of the country where unions have historically been very strong, they tend to be bigger problems. But I think that's part of what we need to do is have labor, the unions, recognize that it's really in their interest to make some concessions. I don't believe that collective bargaining agreements should go away, but I do think that there's got to be some more sanity in them, and there isn't always sanity in them, as was the case in Camden. In terms of the Black community being underserved, the poor Black community being underserved with police and wanting and needing police, I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, I think that there are a lot of white middle-class millennials who believe that Black Americans are universally mistreated by the cops and hate them and don't want them in their communities. And look, what do I know? But that has not been my experience at all. I think that many of those communities need police more than anything. They just need good police. They want it done the right way. And so to say that the Black community doesn't want police, I think is completely misguided. And finally, the war on drugs. I'll just say that I can't fully disagree with that, but I also can't fully agree with it. I do think that there's a lot of violence that comes with the drug trade, and you have to, if you're going to end the war on drugs, you've got to find a way to take the black market out of it, to take the illicit drug trade completely out of it. It has not happened with marijuana. I know that was the intent, but in most states, there's not a legitimate government market, a government regulated market for marijuana that's able to sell less expensively, frankly. And so therefore the gray and black markets still predominate, still have the violence associated with them. So police will always have to deal with it. There's still going to be drug related violence. They're still going to have to deal with that. And it's difficult to deal with that if you're all of a sudden unable to enforce drug laws. Just makes it a lot more difficult.
So one question I wanted to ask you, Jason, that came through was, and this is a bit of it fits what you were just talking about. So if the police departments do shrink to some extent because they're spinning off some things. So like we don't have them answering mental health calls and we don't have them answering, homeless calls, whatever. Do you think policing budgets do shrink at some, like, do police departments actually get smaller and have a smaller footprint? Maybe they're doing more focused things in communities. They're doing the things Stephen was just talking about in minority communities. They're doing a better job. Are police departments smaller at the end of the day?
You know, I think if that happens, that's good. I think that, you know, that's not a bad thing. I'm not arguing against that, but my suspicion is it doesn't really work like that. And the reason I say that is that, you know, even if you have social workers or other mental health professionals responding to mental health crisis calls, there are going to be a certain percentage of those calls that are going to be a dual response where you do need law enforcement. You just also need the mental health professionals. There'll be some percentage that can be handled by mental health professionals alone. It's just really hard to say. It kind of depends on how far you go with this. There's some proposals to have police stop responding to car accidents and instead have some civilian investigator that's not armed respond. Look, that's fine. I mean, from the police perspective, do all of that can safely be done. And if that means that the demand for police goes down such that the budget can be reduced, I think that's a great thing. That's good news. But I don't think it really works like that. And I think that there's still going to be significant demand on police. And because we also want to reform our police departments and have them do better, we're also looking at like spending more money on training, spending more money on technology, spending more money on accountability systems, having more internal ability to monitor the performance of officers, and all those things cost money. So look, nobody wants to see the police budget continue to grow. I think really everyone, even inside law enforcement, want to see that stabilize and come down. In many places it is, but some places it's not. But I think we have to take a wait and see approach rather than cut the budget and then say they're not going to need all that money. I think we introduce some changes, some reimagination of law enforcement, mental health professionals, collision investigators, whatever you want, but then monitor what the demand on police is. If it goes down, you reduce the budget.
Okay, so I have a different question now. So we've passed our time. The Federalist Society says we can go a little longer, maybe till 7:30. Do you guys have hard deadlines, or can you do 10 more minutes of questions? Are you guys willing?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I didn't want to interject, but I'm happy to try and respond to your earlier question, Barb.
Okay, so, all right, so I'm going to stop us at 7:30, but we're going to go till then. And Kim, go ahead.
Okay. And first, I just want to say I really appreciate the panel, and I don't think I disagree with anything anyone said, which gives me hope in this time. I agree with everything Steve always says all the time, although sometimes I prefer better cocktails than he does, but that's for another day. So, but I like Mr. Reddy's point about, Mr. Johnson's point about it. It's like up to the legislature does this. I think we do blame the police too often. The legislature can solve these problems. It creates these problems. I also agree with Mr. Reddy's point about that liberals should listen to the fact that if you throw around words like racism, structural racism, systemic racism in a very loose way, then that can turn people off that you want to persuade because it sounds inaccurate. I think both of them spoke to that. So anyway, I just really appreciate this discussion. In terms of changes, you would think from my response, my changes would be to constitutional doctrine, but I think you suggested kind of low-hanging fruit, what could be done quickly, and I don't think the court's going to change anytime soon. So the legislature, I assume, is free to raise the ceiling or the floor on what kind of Fourth Amendment protections people get. So a couple that come to mind, I think it's too readily available for simply stopping someone for a traffic violation to result in a search, whether that's consensual or based on some sort of reasonable suspicion of something that the Supreme Court has upheld. I think this goes to Smith's point about decriminalizing drugs. Even if we weren't to decriminalize drugs, if we could reduce the benefits from pretextual stops. Policing pretext, I think, is very difficult, but you could say you don't automatically get to search and arrest even if you have reasonable suspicion of some sort of traffic violation or even minor criminal offense. So we should go to citations and only talk about if people don't show up. Let's see. Terry versus Ohio, that's not necessary. I assume there's nothing unconstitutional about a legislature saying that you have to have probable cause to investigate somebody, or at least limit it to Terry's original point, which was if you believe someone's armed and dangerous, reasonable suspicion to just pat and search for arms, whereas now reasonable suspicion can lead to investigations, which again result in potential violence, just reasonable suspicion that someone's an undocumented immigrant or somebody might be coming drugs. It should be limited to weapons. So I'll stop there as two ways that legislatures could reform Fourth Amendment doctrines.
Good, good.
Professor, I'll offer a contribution to this discussion also. It's not quite a solution to the overcriminalization problem, but it's a proposed solution to the problems we have in enforcement, and that is to find ways to demilitarize our police forces in the country. It is terrifying. Sometimes you look at police officers and they're dressed like they're in Fallujah. And I think if we could find ways to take these really advanced and sophisticated weapons out of the hands of what are very frequently young men in their 20s and 30s who are interested in using the weapons, and find them fun and exciting. If we could find ways to change use of force policy so that we could de-escalate situations. I think that even something as simple as changing uniforms sometimes to make people in law enforcement look more like members of the community rather than like members of the military. I think all of these things would go towards a very, very healthy culture change. And I think it's very possible that frequently there are communities, urban Black communities very often, where the police officer doesn't seem particularly friendly. It seems like an intimidating, occupying force, I think was the word Professor Smith used. And we could have a very significant culture change if we demilitarize the police. I'm not naive about the difficulty of that proposition. We do live in a country with 300 million people and 400 million guns. And you will have police officers arguing that, it is important for them to maintain a certain level of aggressiveness in order to police that kind of a country. That's not a crazy argument, but I don't necessarily know that it means tanks. I don't know that it means a number of kinds of things that we read stories about all the time. So I do think it is possible to do a little bit of police demilitarization. I think that would be a very, very salutary.
Anyone else on that one? So I had also, this is a slightly different direction, but so Vikrant, you had kind of suggested, so we talked a little bit about structural racism, and I thought your examples suggested that structural racism comes about through mostly benign policies. Like, in other words, a statute gets passed, there's a certain reason for it. It turns out it has a disproportionate effect, and that effect gets baked into the criminal justice system. Gee, if we'd realized that, we wouldn't have done that, right? And I guess I want to not challenge you, but get some input from all of you on, is structural racism really that benign as all of that? And maybe I misunderstood you, but your examples suggested. So, because there's at least some arguments that people make that, structural racism is in some ways designed, that, it's even been argued that structural racism was a replacement for slavery. It was another way to keep Black and brown people in place. And so I guess I want to ask all of you to respond a little bit to that point. And Vikrant, I'll give you the first cut at it because I'm responding to something you said.
Yeah, I don't want to be overly technical with my words, but I was trying to talk about structural or institutional racism. But I think what you're talking about is just racism. And I'm not so naive as to think that that's absent from decision-making or policy-making or law enforcement from time to time. But I do think it's a distinct phenomenon from institutional racism. But sure, I do think that should be obvious that there is racism in American society. But I do also want us to understand that there may be ways that racism manifests itself that I think are not fully appreciated in the current dialogue. So for example, we talked a lot about this defund the police argument and the idea that you take certain policing functions out of a community. And all of that is well and good, but I think both Mr. Johnson and Professor Smith cautioned that you don't take all policing functions out of a community. In fact, that would be racist. That we've had a Jim Crow era in the country where Black communities were badly underpoliced because a number of cities didn't feel that the lives in those communities mattered enough. And that's part of our history, but the way that we talk about the issue now, we seem to be forgetting that really important component and assuming something completely different. So yeah, I guess I'll just close by saying there is such a thing as racism. There are racists. Those things, I think, are distinct from institutional racism, both problems.
So I'll go. The term institutional racism, I tend to avoid because I'm never clear what people mean by it. And sometimes people mean there's systematic bias. Sometimes people mean there's just systematic disparate impact. For me, I would give the example of jury discrimination, and the most systematic studies have been done in the context of the death penalty. So not only in Georgia, but across all states that have the death penalty, it's systematic. In other words, there's a predictable pattern that people who kill white people are significantly more likely to get the death penalty than people who kill Black people. But at the same time, I think that reflects bias. That reflects an undervaluing, we could call it racism, of Black lives. At the same time, you could put every juror under a truth test, and they would swear, and it would be truthful, that they weren't saying, "Oh, because the victim was white, let's impose the death penalty." So it's not completely unconscious in the sense that I think there is a kind of, when they think about and deliberate, you would see different deliberations between the two, but it's just, we're all infected by our cultural racism, some to more than others, but in a way that operates at a level that people often don't even kind of consciously articulate. And so it's systematic. I hesitate to call it institutional, but because for me, it runs through people, it runs through our culture, but I would call it systematic.
You want to weigh in, Stephen?
Sure. I generally agree. I think there is, first of all, I may disagree with Mr. Johnson. I think there is a lot of explicit racism out there. And like the Obama administration's report on Ferguson, they went through emails between police and so forth and court officials, and they were kind of shocking as to what they found. So that there is more actual explicit racism than we would believe. But having said that, I certainly think there's a lot of structural racism, and that's a useful concept. So when police officers think they need to tackle the problem of drugs, I think it's just natural for them to just focus on inner city communities because they think that's where the real drug problem is. Well, we all know that there's plenty of drug use and dealing in wealthier areas and suburban areas. It's not as easy perhaps to detect there as it is in inner city open air drug markets. But I think they just have this implicit belief that Black and brown men especially are much more likely to be criminals, to be engaged in drug illicit activities than other people. And so when you look at stop and frisk in New York, which Trump seems to love for understandable reasons, I mean, it was pretty clear. The ACLU had a poster and they said, don't want to get stopped by NYPD, don't be black or brown, right? Because a huge amount of the stops, I think 90% of the stops, roughly, I haven't looked at the numbers lately, were of black people and Hispanic people. They were stopped and frisked. The yield rate for black and brown people, by which I mean the rate at which contraband drugs or weapons were found, was lower than whites. So it seemed to me the police were doing a good job when it came to white people. When race was taken out of the equation, they could actually look for indicia of criminal behavior and predict with much greater accuracy. When it came to whites, when it came to black and brown people, the color seemed itself to be the basis for suspicion. Now, they may not be saying, let's stop that black guy, or I want to stop every black guy, but I think just at an implicit level, when they have in their minds who is likely to have a concealed weapon, who's likely to be carrying drugs, they think black and brown people and whites get a pass. I mean, and so we need to train police officers. They need training in these areas. I think we need more representative police departments. Ferguson was 70% black, the city of Ferguson in Missouri, 70% black. At the time of Michael Brown's killing, the police department, I think, was 90% white in that jurisdiction. Huge disproportionality in the makeup of the police department. It did not reflect in the least the community they were supposed to be serving. And so there are problems with that. But I certainly don't subscribe to the view that all police are explicitly racist. I think police have very difficult jobs, and in a way we demand too much of them. Too much of the burden of regulation in our country falls on their shoulders. And I think it would aid police greatly if we sort of reimagined policing and took a lot of extraneous functions that could be better performed by, say, mental health professionals, social workers. We take those out of the police's hands, they can focus on violent crime, the kinds of crimes that make communities safer when they're solved.
Okay. Jason, did you want to say something?
Yeah, if I could just say a few words. I know we're over time. In terms of drug enforcement in urban communities versus suburban communities, clearly a lot of drug use and dealing in suburban communities as well. That's an absolutely valid point. I would only say that the drug enforcement by police tends to be driven by violence. So in communities where drug use and dealing is driving violent crime, you're going to see more stop and frisk. You're going to see more drug arrests. You're going to see more of those kinds of activities. Cultivating informants, looking for sources of information, closing homicide cases in urban communities often is interlinked with drug enforcement. How to close those cases is to engage in drug enforcement. Much different strategy in the suburbs. Not that there aren't acts of violence related to drugs in the suburbs. It's just the dynamics are a lot different. Doesn't explain everything. Absolutely doesn't explain everything. But I think it's something to consider in the different strategies.
Sure.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I think this was a great discussion. I wish we could go longer because I think it's just a good discussion. I hope all of you have enjoyed it out there. And thank you again for the Federalist Society for putting this together. And I think we're at the end. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you, fellow panelists.
Take care.